8 years after our divorce, Lydia Grant stood in the most expensive showroom she'd ever managed and dismissed me in under 30 seconds. She'd made up her mind the moment she saw me in that uniform, her ex-husband running a polishing cloth over cars she sold. She wasn't looking at a threat. She was looking at confirmation of everything she'd always believed. What she didn't know was that I had been watching this dealership for 3 months. The real question was whether she had ever bothered to find out who she was actually dealing with. If you've ever had someone look straight through you and see exactly what they expected, this story is for you. Before we go any further, if you want more stories like this one, go ahead and hit subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it means you'll be here when the next one comes. 3 months before Lydia pressed that polishing cloth against my chest and told me I couldn't afford a wheel, I was sitting in a conference room in a building I had good reason to know well, working through a stack of complaint documents that shouldn't have needed to exist. The reports had come through an anonymous channel, one that bypassed every layer of dealership management and routed directly to a small team authorized to receive exactly this kind of material. In 90 days, 23 of them had arrived. Different names, different time frames, different specific incidents. But the shape underneath each one was always the same. Commission payments that vanished the week they were scheduled to process. Performance reviews that somehow deteriorated between the date a manager signed them and the date they appeared in the employee file. Service packages added to contracts after customers had already signed. Complaints logged as resolved with no documentation of any actual resolution, no conversation recorded, no outcome explained. I had sent 3 separate inquiries through the regional operations office. Each time the report that came back was thorough, professionally written, and filtered through the same management structure that was generating the complaints. The dealership, according to every internal review, was performing within acceptable parameters. The incidents were isolated. The system was working. I had built enough systems in my life to recognize when one was protecting itself instead of doing its job. So I stopped sending reports through proper channels and made arrangements to see things from the ground up. Arden Motors was never supposed to become what it became. When I started the company, I was 31 years old, working out of a converted warehouse in Waukegan with a patent on a battery management architecture that 3 larger manufacturers had already passed on. My marriage to Lydia had ended the previous spring, not with a catastrophic moment, but with the slow erosion of a woman watching a man spend years on something she had quietly stopped believing would work. She wasn't wrong to leave. She was wrong about the reason. The thermal regulation layer I'd spent years developing changed the efficiency numbers enough that the entire conversation around the technology shifted. Within 2 years, the first limited run. Within 4, a waiting list. Within 8, a brand valuation that showed up on financial publication covers. The executives who appeared at industry events were talented, polished, and very good at being visible. I had always preferred not to be. Of the 1,400 people who worked for Arden, most had never seen my face, which made a temporary prep technician contract at the Chicago flagship exactly the kind of position no one would look twice at. That was how I found myself on a cold Tuesday in early spring, pulling pre-delivery inspection sheets from the service bay clipboard and trying to understand what Preston Hale had built. Preston was the kind of general manager who almost never left his fingerprints on anything that could be directly tied to a consequence. I watched him work for a week before the pattern became legible. I saw it happen clearly on day 3 with a floor scheduling decision. He walked into a team meeting, said he was curious how they were thinking about client reassignment protocols when a senior manager was at capacity, then excused himself to take a call. 30 minutes later, a decision had been made that aligned with exactly what the question had implied, and Preston had technically not been in the room when it happened. 3 internal audits had found nothing because there was almost nothing with his name directly on it. The architecture of his operation was designed so that his involvement stopped exactly 1 step before any action that could be called a violation. The execution belonged to Blake Turner. Blake was the regional finance director, methodical, the way certain people are methodical, not out of caution, but out of genuine professional satisfaction in doing something technical with precision. He processed the commission adjustments, modified client intake timestamps to change who appeared to have originated a customer relationship, and routed the financial overage through a consulting arrangement that connected through 3 corporate layers to a company Preston quietly controlled. Blake did most of this from his own workstation, with one important exception I would learn later. An exception that would matter considerably when the time came to trace exactly who had authorized what. In the world Blake operated in, oversight was a formality that moved too slowly and knew too little to be a real concern. That confidence was going to cost him considerably. Eleanor Banks managed human resources, and Eleanor was the part of this I found the most difficult to categorize. She wasn't taking money. She wasn't directing anything. What Eleanor was doing was absorbing friction. The complaints that should have surfaced, the problem, the performance evaluations that arrived in her office looking different from the versions she'd seen a week earlier. She logged everything, processed, everything closed. Complaints with notations that said no discrepancy had been found, and sent altered evaluations through for final filing without asking why the language had changed. I watched her make 3 decisions, over 11 days, each one of which she had to know was wrong, and she made every single one with the flat efficiency of someone who had long ago reclassified this kind of choice as routine. She hadn't become comfortable with it suddenly. She had become comfortable with it gradually, one small accommodation at a time, until the distance between where she started and where she was had become too large to look at directly. And then there was Lydia. I had known she was at this location before I accepted the assignment. Her name appeared in the org chart as Regional Sales Director, a position she'd reached through a genuine talent for reading clients and a practiced instinct for positioning herself near success without carrying accountability for anything that went wrong. She and Preston had been together for at least 2 years. The relationship between her sales decisions and his financial ones was not coincidental. She moved clients, he moved money, and the space between those 2 actions was where most of the damage happened. The morning of my first day, she was crossing the floor toward the service entrance when she caught sight of me near the delivery bay, pulling inspection paperwork from the clipboard rack. I watched her face move through 3 separate expressions in the time it takes to draw a breath. Recognition, immediate and certain. A flash of genuine surprise she controlled quickly. And then, something that settled into quiet satisfaction, like a question she'd been carrying for 8 years, had just answered itself without any effort on her part. She looked at me in that uniform and decided in about 2 seconds that I had failed. She didn't ask a single question. She just folded that conclusion into her understanding of how the world worked and walked away already comfortable with the answer. The certainty was total, and the certainty was exactly what made her dangerous to herself. I first noticed Simone Carter on day 4, though I didn't understand the full significance of what I was watching until day 7. She worked the high-value floor, the section set aside for customers considering the upper tier of the lineup, and she had a quality that is genuinely rare in sales. She listened in a way that made the other person feel like the only worthwhile source of information in the room. When she did speak, the customer leaned toward her rather than back. She didn't oversell. She didn't need to. Her commission records, however, told a story that bore no resemblance to what I was watching through the prep bay window. According to the system, Simone was a middle-of-the-road performer whose client relationships regularly required reassignment to senior managers to close successfully. The reassignment always happened after the customer had already committed, after the handshake, after the initial paperwork in that narrow window before final documentation. Blake's timestamp modifications rewrote the history of each transaction, moving the record of who had initiated the relationship to a point before Simone's first contact. She had filed 2 complaints. Both had been closed by Eleanor's office with a note that no discrepancy had been identified. What I discovered on day 9 changed the timeline of everything. I had been watching Simone manage a situation involving a client file that had been transferred mid-negotiation, a pattern I'd now seen enough times to recognize when I noticed she wasn't reacting the way someone who has no options reacts. She was careful. She was specific about which systems she used and when. Later, when I had a few minutes at the service bay workstation running inventory checks, I found something in the document metadata that told me she had been more methodical about her own protection than anyone had given her credit for. Simone had been saving versions of her contract files at key stages before and after the periods when transfers typically happened. The originals were sitting quietly in a personal backup she'd created on a removable drive she kept in her bag. The documents weren't complete proof of everything, but they were a timeline. They were her record of what had happened written at the moments it was happening, which is the only kind of evidence that can't be reconstructed after the fact. The same morning, Preston's voice carried through Eleanor's open office doorway. He was walking past, not stopping. He told her to begin preparing termination documentation for Simone Carter's suspected client data, misappropriation delivered in the tone of someone noting a minor scheduling update. Eleanor wrote it down without looking up. I thought about what I'd heard for the rest of the afternoon. I could walk into Preston's office right now, identify myself, and stop this in under 20 minutes. Simone would keep her job. The commission theft would end. And then Preston would spend the next 48 hours making sure that by the time any formal investigation reached his records, there was nothing left but a series of individually defensible administrative decisions. He would close the consulting arrangements, dissolve the shell company layers, and ensure every financial irregularity could be explained as a clerical error. I would save one person. The architecture built to exploit dozens more would survive, reconfigure, and continue under new management. I didn't walk into Preston's office. Instead, I made 3 calls from the parking garage during my afternoon break to Rochelle Pierce, who had been running parallel oversight on this investigation from the outside, to corporate legal, and to the head of data security. What I needed was a protocol that would freeze the entire system exactly as it stood before anyone understood they were being observed. The authorization bypassed the dealership's internal IT administrator entirely and locked every access record, transaction history, and security file to the corporate server with 2-layer authentication. Nothing could be deleted, altered, or overwritten without the attempt itself being captured as a separate, independently time-stamped entry. Every time Preston's team touched anything from this point forward, they were adding to the record they believed they were controlling. That evening, I found a window to speak with Simone alone near the back of the inventory lot during the overlap between shift changes when the floor was briefly understaffed. She had the composure of someone who has been managing sustained pressure long enough that it no longer shows in expression, only in the careful precision of her words and the specific things she left out of every sentence. I told her I was aware of what was being prepared. I told her the documents she had been keeping were valuable, and that their value depended entirely on how they were handled from here. She needed to leave them exactly where they were, not copy them, not send them, not remove anything from company property. The people moving against her were waiting for exactly that step. The moment she gave them something they could characterize as theft, everything she had became evidence she had stolen rather than evidence they had forged. She looked at me for a long moment, a prep technician in a company uniform telling her to trust a process that had already failed her twice through official channels. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. I told her I needed her to hold on a little longer and that I understood how much weight that request carried. She didn't answer right away. She looked past me toward the lot, then back. Then she nodded once, turned, and went inside. I finished the prep work for the cars going out the following morning and stayed until the lot closed. Somewhere on the floor above the service bay, Preston Hale was managing his operation with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he had designed something that couldn't be dismantled from below him. He was right about one thing. What was coming wasn't going to come from below him. The days after my conversation with Simone settled into a rhythm that looked from the outside exactly like the routine of a prep technician who had accepted his place in the building's hierarchy. I arrived early, worked through the inspection sheets, kept my head down in the way that people in low-status positions are expected to keep their heads down. Lydia walked past me on the floor at least twice a day and never acknowledged me directly. I had been categorized, filed away, assigned to a mental drawer marked confirmed and closed. That certainty she carried was more useful to me than any cover story I could have constructed. What I was actually doing was watching the system operate in real time and understanding the specific elegance of how Preston had built it. The genius of it, and it was a kind of genius the dark and self-serving variety, was that every individual action existed inside its own plausible explanation. When Lydia reassigned a client from Simone to one of the floor managers, she favored the paperwork described it as a resource reallocation decision based on workload balancing. When Blake adjusted a timestamp on a client contact record to show that the senior manager had made first contact 3 days earlier than he actually had, the system logged it as a data correction. When Eleanor updated a performance evaluation after the reviewing manager had already signed it, her notation called the changes a standardization of language to align with current HR documentation guidelines. None of these actions examined individually and in isolation would have triggered an audit flag. Preston had spent years calibrating the pressure to stay just below every threshold that might generate automatic scrutiny. What he hadn't accounted for was someone who could see all of them at once from the same position, with access to the unedited version of every record he believed had been successfully modified. I watched a specific sequence unfold during my second week that illustrated the machine better than anything else I observed. One of Simone's regular clients, a woman who had purchased 2 vehicles through her over the previous 4 years, came in to discuss an upgrade. Simone spent nearly 3 hours with her across 2 visits, walked her through the full model comparison, arranged a test drive, and put together a written proposal the client took home to review. The proposal had Simone's name on it. The follow-up call that closed the deal, made from Simone's extension at a time when she was documented as being with another client on the floor, was recorded under the account of a senior manager named Davis, who sat near the back office and had, as far as I could observe, not met this particular customer once. By the time the commission was calculated, Simone had contributed administrative support to a transaction that Davis had originated and closed entirely through his own client relationship. That was the story the data told. The story I watched through the prep bay window was different in every specific detail. And it wasn't just money. About 2 weeks into my time at the dealership, I noticed a framed certificate near the manager's corridor, a quarterly recognition award for service innovation. The program it referenced was a client follow-up system I had watched Simone present in the common area during my first week, complete with a written proposal and a 15-minute walkthrough for the floor staff. The name on the certificate belonged to a sales associate who worked 2 desks from Lydia's office. The date on the certificate was 6 weeks after Simone's presentation. I didn't say anything about it. I photographed it from the service corridor during a routine pass and forwarded it to Rochelle. Some costs can be calculated in commission dollars. Some can't, and those are often the ones that leave the deepest damage. That afternoon, I saw Simone at her desk after the floor cleared. She was looking at her commission summary on the screen with the expression of someone reading a document in a language they are fluent in, but that keeps producing sentences that shouldn't grammatically be possible. She knew. She had known for a long time. But knowing and being able to demonstrate the difference between those 2 states is everything, and the system had been designed to make that gap as wide as possible. The Arden sovereign situation developed during my 3rd week, and it was the point at which what had been a systematic exploitation became something that could not be characterized as anything other than deliberate criminal coordination. The Sovereign was our most limited production model, fewer than 200 units globally per year, hand-built, with a price point that put it in the category of assets rather than vehicles. The Chicago flagship had allocation for 3 units in the current cycle. 1 had been reserved for a corporate client, a logistics company whose executive team had been in conversation with Simone for 6 weeks. She had managed the entire relationship, identified the decision-maker, structured the proposal around his specific priorities, arranged the technical briefing, and brought the transaction to the point of final documentation without a single misstep. 2 days before the delivery was scheduled, Lydia transferred the entire account to a senior manager. The reassignment was entered into the system as a standard resource decision. But what Blake had done to the contract itself was the part that moved this from commission theft to something considerably more serious. Embedded in the final documentation were 4 service packages, each with a product code, each described in language that sounded like standard extended coverage. I checked those product codes during a lunch break on a personal device carrying access credentials I had arranged before arriving at the dealership. None of the codes corresponded to anything in Arden's actual service catalog. They were fabricated. The fees attached to them, amounting to a significant sum above the vehicle price, were structured to route through the consulting arrangement that connected through enough corporate layers to require patience to trace. Back to a company Preston controlled through a third-party holding structure. Simone was informed that her cooperation in finalizing the delivery would result in a partial commission recovery. She was also informed in professional phrasing, careful enough to be unimpeachable on the record, that her refusal to confirm the service packages as ones she had recommended would be treated as evidence of unwillingness to support dealership revenue objectives, which would become relevant to the performance documentation currently being assembled. I learned the substance of this from 2 separate sources within 48 hours, and the consistency between the accounts told me the message had been delivered clearly. She refused to sign. She refused to confirm packages that didn't exist and would take real money from a client who trusted her regardless of what that refusal cost her. Her refusal was noted. The termination documentation Eleanor had been preparing was accelerated. I was assigned to prep the Sovereign for its delivery. During the pre-delivery inspection, I spent time with the technical systems in the way that someone familiar with the underlying architecture would naturally spend time with them. The warranty documentation included in the delivery set had an identification string that didn't match the vehicle's registered profile in our production database. It was a small inconsistency, the kind that means nothing to someone unfamiliar with how those strings were structured and everything to someone who understood the generation logic used in our production system. The warranty package had been generated outside the legitimate system and inserted into the delivery set manually. Preston noticed me looking at it. I became aware of his attention. The way you become aware of a temperature change, something in the peripheral quality of the room shifted. He said something quietly to the person beside him. I set the documentation back in the delivery folder, picked up my inspection checklist, and continued working through the exterior condition points as though nothing had registered. Later, I learned Preston had raised a concern about me to Lydia. He described his observation without specifics, just a sense that the seasonal hire seemed unusually familiar with technical documentation he had no reason to examine. Lydia's response, delivered at a volume that suggested she was not worried about being overheard, was that Preston needed to trust her judgment about her ex-husband's capabilities and current circumstances. She had known him for more than a decade. She knew exactly what he was. Preston let it go not because she had satisfied him, but because the launch event was 4 days away, and he had priorities that required his attention. What he decided, having let it go, was to eliminate the variable entirely. He told Blake to handle it. Blake handled it the way he handled everything, methodically, with the confidence of someone who has never operated inside a system with genuine accountability. On a Tuesday evening after most staff had left, he used his own administrator credentials to access the dealership's physical master key override, the same override used for emergency vehicle retrieval when digital systems failed to sign out a backup key for the Sovereign at 9:10. The master override didn't generate a standard user-level access record, which was precisely why he used it. Then Blake crossed to Preston's workstation, which Preston had left running as he routinely did during late evenings when he expected to return, opened a session from Preston's still active login, and created a new user account in the Employee Access Directory under the name D. Ellison. The account's creation timestamp read 9:47. The physical key sign-out performed through the master override 37 minutes earlier was then connected retroactively to the D. Ellison account as the authorizing access event. The physical key itself was placed inside the locker assigned to my temporary employee credentials. A financial transfer from one of the consulting arrangement's holding structures moved a specific sum into a temporary payroll account linked to my employee ID number, structured to suggest an off-ledger payment for undocumented services. The internal security footage for two areas, the finance office and the vehicle storage corridor, was edited to place a figure in those spaces during the Tuesday evening window. What Blake did not know was that the corporate preservation lock had been capturing every event on every device in that building for 3 weeks. Every keystroke on Preston's workstation during that session had been recorded, including the account creation. The master override log showed two separate authorization events, Blake's own administrative credentials at 9:10 and the D. Ellison account at 9:47. The gap between those two events made the sequence impossible. You cannot use an account that doesn't exist yet to authorize a physical action that already happened 37 minutes ago. The original security footage automatically backed up to the corporate server before Blake's edit was saved, showed empty corridors throughout the relevant hours. The system had recorded everything, including the precise moment Blake's hands had tried to rewrite it. Lydia filed the report the following morning, a thorough, professionally structured document alleging coordination between me and Simone to access restricted vehicle inventory, misappropriate client financial data, and divert commission payments. Eleanor received the termination paperwork for both of us that afternoon. I know she opened the key access log report as part of her standard review because the preservation system recorded every document she opened and the duration of each viewing session. She spent 47 seconds on the page that showed the access timestamps long enough to read it twice. She would have seen that the account attributed to me had been created at 9:47, 37 minutes after the physical action it supposedly authorized. She would have understood that the sequence was not possible. She had 47 seconds in which she held that contradiction in her hands and made a choice. Then she closed the document and processed the paperwork. I want to be precise about what I felt when I learned this, because it would be easy to call it anger, and that wouldn't be accurate. It was closer to the particular exhaustion that comes from watching something you already understood confirm itself. Eleanor hadn't become a different person in that moment. She had made the same choice she had made 37 times before, and this time, the thing she was choosing not to see was a fabricated case against two people who had done nothing wrong. The accumulation of those choices had made this one feel to her like it was still within the range of normal. That was perhaps the most accurate indictment of what Preston had built. It had normalized Eleanor's participation so gradually that she could still think of herself as someone who simply processed documents. On the evening before the launch event, I had a brief call with Rochelle. Everything was in place. The documentation was complete, the legal team had reviewed it, and the forensic accounting had traced the financial flows through all 3 layers of Preston's consulting structure to the underlying company. The preliminary contact our legal team had made with the relevant authorities over the past several days was exactly that, a confidential notification of intent, not a formal action. The process would not begin officially until Preston stood at a podium and presented fabricated documentation to a room full of witnesses, at which point the intent would be undeniable and the record would be complete. Rochelle understood why I needed to wait for that moment. A private confrontation could be negotiated, reframed, walked back with enough lawyers and enough time. What I needed was for them to do what they were planning in a room full of people on the record, with no ambiguity about the sequence of events. The morning of the launch, I picked up the polishing cloth from the supply cart and started on the Sovereign. I worked through the exterior methodically, saving the hood last. I wasn't thinking specifically about what was coming. I was thinking about Simone at her desk looking at a commission statement that lied to her in clear language and the 47 seconds Eleanor had spent with a document she understood and chose to set aside, and the service innovation certificate hanging in the corridor with someone else's name on something Simone had built. I set the cloth on the cart, checked the inspection sheet one final time, and went to get ready. There was nothing left to do but let them finish building what they believed was a trap. The guests arrived in the way that people with serious money always arrive at events designed for them, unhurried, attentive to the room before committing to entering it fully, reading the space the way they read any negotiation. By the time the showroom reached capacity, there were perhaps 80 people distributed across the floor, executives, regional partners, two journalists from publications covering the luxury automotive segment, and dealership staff positioned near the display vehicles with the practiced availability of people who had been briefed on where to stand. The Sovereign occupied the center of the floor under a lighting arrangement calibrated to make the paint surface look poured rather than applied. It was genuinely beautiful. I had spent the morning with it, and even I felt the pull of the thing when the room lighting hit it at the right angle. I stayed near the delivery bay entrance where the floor met the service corridor. From there, I had a clear sightline to the main display area, the presentation podium Preston had positioned near the vehicle, and the cluster of senior managers arranged to his left, Davis among them, standing with the relaxed confidence of someone whose paperwork was in order, and who expected the evening to confirm what the paperwork said. Simone was near the far wall, close enough to the floor that her absence would be noticed far enough from the center that her presence had been rendered functionally invisible. She held the posture of someone who has decided that composure is the only thing currently within her control, and she was holding it precisely. Lydia was working the room, moving through the guest clusters with the efficiency of someone who understood that events like this were relationship maintenance operations, not social occasions, and she was very good at the work. When she caught sight of me near the bay entrance at some point during the first hour, something shifted briefly in her expression. Not concern, just a recalibration of the evening's available entertainment. She excused herself from the conversation she was in, crossed the floor, and what followed next is what I described at the beginning of this story. The cloth pressed against my chest. The comment about the wheel delivered in the tone of someone stating a fact too obvious to require emphasis. Then she walked back toward the entrance, smoothing her jacket, already resetting her expression for the cameras near the door. I took the cloth. I looked at my watch. Rochelle's team was in the parking structure. There was nothing left to confirm. I was simply waiting for Preston to do what Preston was going to do. He moved to the podium 20 minutes into the event, just after the formal vehicle presentation. The Sovereign had been revealed with appropriate ceremony, and the room had responded with the quality of attention that genuine craftsmanship earns. Then Preston cleared his throat, acknowledged the audience, and said that before the evening continued, he needed to address a security matter that he felt the dealership's valued partners deserved to hear about directly. He framed the disclosure as a demonstration of transparency. He expressed regret that the event had to include a difficult announcement. He said that an internal investigation had uncovered evidence that two staff members had been coordinating to access restricted vehicle inventory, misappropriate client financial records, and redirect commission payments in ways that affected both the dealership and its customers. He named us. He described the evidence, the key access record, the financial transfer, the security footage. He said the documentation had been reviewed and verified, and that the affected employees would be removed from the premises immediately. The floor managers who had benefited from Simone's reassigned accounts delivered their confirmations when Preston gestured toward them, brief, practiced, consistent in the way that accounts are consistent when coordinated in advance. Eleanor stood near the side wall with her hands folded in front of her. She looked at a point in the middle distance that didn't correspond to anything in the room, and she held that position with the stillness of someone who has made their choice and is now simply waiting for the moment to pass. Lydia crossed to me and lifted my temporary employee badge from around my neck with the efficiency of someone removing something misplaced rather than something belonging to a person. She dropped it on the floor between us and told me and Simone in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough that our employment was terminated effective immediately and that security would escort us out. She looked at me when she said it, and there was something in her expression that I can only describe as relief. The specific satisfaction of someone who has watched a situation finally resolve itself the way they always believed it would. I picked the badge up from the floor and put it in my pocket. Then I reached for the evidence preservation box I had positioned near the base of the delivery bay station that morning, placed the Sovereign's primary display key inside. It confirmed the digital lock with my thumbprint, and set it carefully on the delivery cart. Lydia watched this, and assumed I think that I was performing a dignity the situation didn't support. I checked my watch one final time, and sent a single-word confirmation to Rochelle. Every display screen in the dealership switched simultaneously. The promotional content cut to black, then to white text on a dark field emergency audit owner authorization. The ambient sound of the room changed before anyone spoke. The quality of the silence that preceded the reaction was the sound of 80 people recalibrating what kind of evening this had become. Preston moved to the building management station immediately. His administrative credentials had been revoked 45 minutes earlier, at the exact moment he had begun presenting what he described as verified evidence. He entered his password twice. The screen returned the same response both times. He looked at the display with the expression of a man encountering a locked door in a room he has always controlled, trying to determine whether the lock is broken or whether the key has been changed. The main entrance opened and Rochelle came in with her team, 4 from the forensic accounting group, 2 from corporate legal, 2 from internal security. They moved into the room with the efficiency of people who had prepared for this specific space and knew exactly where they were going. Lydia turned toward the entrance and instructed the nearest security staff member to remove the people who had just walked in. The security staff member looked at Rochelle, then back at Lydia, and did not move. Thomas Wren, who sat on the Arden board and had flown in from the New York office that morning, his presence explained to the dealership staff as routine executive attendance at a product launch, stepped forward from the edge of the room where he had been standing for the past hour. He introduced himself briefly and then read without editorializing the relevant summary. Damon Ellison was the founder of Arden Motors, the holder of its core patent portfolio, the controlling shareholder of Delaney Mobility Group, and the beneficial owner of this dealership. He had been present on the floor for the past 3 weeks, in a prep technician capacity, conducting a direct investigation into complaints that had been repeatedly dismissed through internal channels. The room absorbed this with the stillness of people processing something that changes the structure of what they thought they were standing inside. I confirmed what Thomas had said and stated that I had authorized the investigation, that I had observed the operation directly, and that I was acting on findings that the regular management hierarchy had been specifically designed to prevent from reaching anyone with authority to act on them. I then immediately suspended the management authorities of Preston Hale and Lydia Grant, froze the accounts connected to the consulting arrangement, and directed the security team to begin sealing company devices. Lydia's response came quickly. She said with practiced composure that this was a personal matter between 2 people with a difficult history, and that the investigation had been constructed to use corporate resources to pursue a private grievance following their divorce. It was a reasonable construction. It would have worked in a room where the evidence didn't exist. I didn't answer the accusation about our marriage. I looked across the room to where Simone was standing near the far wall, still holding the composure she had maintained through the entire presentation. I asked her to come forward. She walked across the floor with the careful steadiness of someone who has been carrying a great deal of weight and is not entirely certain the ground will continue to be reliable. When she reached the center of the room, I turned to address the people still present. The investigation had not started because Lydia had mocked me in front of a room full of people. It had started because someone in this building had been systematically dismantled. Her work, taken her record, falsified her integrity, used as raw material for a fraud she refused to participate in. And every system designed to prevent exactly that had been captured by the people running it. Simone had done everything correctly. She had raised concerns through proper channels. She had kept her own documentation carefully and quietly when she understood the official record was being rewritten around her. She had refused to sign paperwork she knew was fraudulent, even when it would have cost her considerably less to sign. And she had held on when holding on cost her real money and real professional standing for months, without any assurance that anyone above her in the structure was paying attention. The investigation existed because of what she had chosen to do. What happened next existed because of what she had chosen not to do when it would have been much easier. Rochelle's presentation took 31 minutes. She moved through the evidence in a specific sequence, technical first, then financial, then personnel, because that order made the connections between layers impossible to dismiss as coincidence by the time the full picture was visible. She began with the key access record. The D. Ellison account had been created at 9:47 on that Tuesday evening from Preston Hale's registered workstation, a session that building access logs confirmed Preston had left running, as he routinely did during late evenings when he expected to return. Blake had used that open session to create the account, but the physical master override that signed out the backup key had been activated at 9:37 minutes before the D. Ellison account existed. Two separate authorization events, each captured independently by the preservation system, showed a sequence that could not have happened in the order Blake had intended. A physical action cannot be authorized by an account that has not yet been created. The video footage Preston had presented to the room carried modification metadata from the previous evening. The original footage, automatically captured on the corporate server before the edit was saved, showed empty corridors throughout the relevant hours. The backup key had never activated the sovereign systems. The vehicle's own onboard access log, drawn from the car's internal memory, rather than the dealership's editable records, showed it had remained in storage throughout the entire night in question. The financial trace showed 3 corporate layers connecting the fabricated service package fees to a holding company whose original incorporation documents carried Preston's signature as a private investor, with no disclosure to Arden's compliance office. Lydia's signature appeared on the authorization for the commission transfer documentation and on the account change that removed Simone from the primary transaction record. The timing of her signatures placed them after the customer had already signed the purchase commitment, not before, as a genuine resource allocation decision would require. Rochelle closed without editorializing. She presented what the records showed and let the room draw its own conclusions. Preston's termination was immediate. His equity participation performance bonuses and deferred compensation structure were voided under the fraud provisions of his employment agreement. His file was handed to the relevant investigative authorities with whom corporate legal had been in preliminary confidential contact for several days, a notification of intent that became a formal submission the moment Preston stood at a podium and presented fabricated documentation to 80 witnesses. Lydia's situation was its own category. She had not designed the financial architecture, but she had used it, protected it, and signed documentation that moved money through it while knowing what she was signing. Her employment ended immediately. Her performance-based compensation from the relevant period was voided. The civil and criminal dimensions would be determined by people outside my control, and I made no representations about outcomes I couldn't guarantee. When she pulled me aside near the delivery bay afterward and asked for a private conversation, I told her I wouldn't be taking private conversations on matters that were now part of a formal legal and regulatory process. What she was looking for was a negotiation. What the situation required was accountability, and those two things do not occupy the same room. Blake Turner had begun cooperating with Rochelle's team before the event was over. He had understood from the moment the screens changed that the technical foundation he believed was untraceable had been fully traced. His employment was terminated. His cooperation would be factored into what came next, but it would not alter what the records showed he had done. Eleanor's situation required a different kind of accounting. She hadn't touched the money. She hadn't originated fabrications. What she had done was process, file, close, and sign 37 times over the course of the operation's existence, at every point where genuine review would have interrupted the mechanism. The last time she had held a document with an impossible timestamp for 47 seconds and made a choice. She was removed from her position immediately. A formal professional review was initiated with findings to be shared with the relevant licensing bodies. I was not going to describe this as a lesser consequence, because the harm her choices had enabled was not lesser. It was just differently authored. The floor managers, whose accounts had involved Simone's reassigned clients, were interviewed independently by a third-party firm over the following week, separated entirely from the dealership's internal HR process. Their situations were assessed individually, and the assessments reflected the specific nature of each person's participation, rather than a blanket judgment applied uniformly across everyone who had benefited from what Preston built. The clients whose contracts had included fabricated service package codes were contacted within 48 hours. Each of them received full documentation of what had happened, a complete refund of any fees connected to the fraudulent packages, additional compensation for the breach of trust, and corrected contracts, reflecting their actual purchase terms, and whatever legitimate coverage they had originally intended to buy. Some of them had been ardent customers for years. They deserved a clear explanation before they heard anything from anyone else. Simone received a formal public acknowledgement at the close of the proceedings delivered by Rochelle on behalf of the corporate office. Her full commission history was recalculated against the original unmodified records, and the difference between what she had been paid and what she had actually earned was processed within 72 hours with applicable interest. Her personnel file was corrected in its entirety. The performance documentation Eleanor had processed was voided and replaced with accurate records drawn from the preserved data. In the months that followed, when the dealership created a new oversight role responsible for employee experience and process integrity, Simone was invited to apply through the same process open to every qualified candidate. She got the position because she was the best person for it. I made sure the selection process was designed so the outcome could only be explained that way. The months that followed involved rebuilding the dealership's operational structure from the ground up, and this part mattered as much as any of the rest of it, because accountability without structural change is just a story about one bad situation that got fixed. The commission tracking system was replaced with one that maintained a full edit history. Every change to a client record, every account transfer, every adjustment to who was listed as the originating contact was permanently logged and could not be modified without authorization from two independent departments. Incentive payments were calculated automatically from the original data and could not be adjusted by a single manager acting alone. Every financial product warranty package and service agreement offered to customers was listed in a verified catalog with standardized language publicly accessible at the point of sale so customers could read exactly what they were agreeing to before they agreed to it. 2. A reporting channel was established that routed directly to the corporate oversight office with no intermediate layer that could be controlled by the people being reported on. Employee performance evaluations were tied to objective metrics and required dual verification, and every employee had the right to view every version of their own file, including any changes made after an initial review was completed. These weren't punishments for what had happened. They were the acknowledgement that what had happened was possible because the system had been designed with gaps large enough to sustain a years-long fraud. Closing those gaps was the only version of this outcome that meant anything beyond one dealership on one afternoon in Chicago. On the morning the dealership reopened under its new management structure, I came back in the same uniform. There was something accurate about showing up in the same clothes for the beginning that I had worn for the middle. The polishing cloth Lydia had pressed against my chest was still at the prep station where I'd left it the evening before. I picked it up, moved to the Sovereign, which had been held during the investigation, and was now being delivered to its corporate client under accurate documentation, and worked through the exterior one more time before the showroom opened. There was a fingerprint on the hood from the previous evening's handling. I removed it the way you remove any imperfection, carefully with attention, because the work is worth doing right regardless of who is watching. The new team was assembled near the sales floor when I finished. I told them one thing before handing the building over to the people who would actually run it. The lesson here was not that they should treat everyone with respect, because the person holding the polishing cloth might turn out to own the building. That framing makes decency contingent on status, and that was precisely the logic that had made this place what it had been. The lesson was that they should treat people well when there is no possibility that the person in front of them will ever have any power over their circumstances. Treat them that way consistently as a matter of principle, and everything else follows from that. Fail at that, and no amount of performance on every other dimension makes the place worth what it costs to keep running. I set the cloth down on the prep station, handed the evidence box to the legal team's representative near the entrance, and walked out through the service corridor the same way I had walked in 3 weeks earlier when no one in the building had known my name. Real power doesn't prove itself by making the people who underestimated you regret it. It proves itself by being used to protect the people who had no protection, and then by building something that doesn't require another person in a uniform to show up before the next Simone Carter gets treated fairly. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribe. The stories worth telling are always the ones worth passing on.